Just 1 second, let me... Well, Ernie, I want to talk with you a little bit about the whole area of political correctness. That's become a buzzword, and I'm not entirely happy with it, but it does collect a lot of thoughts that are being bandied about these days. And it's, as I understand the term, has become popular within the last year or so. The New York Times talked about it, although for a couple decades it's been around and people using it often in ironic kind of ways. But and it refers to a lot of different kind of questions. It raises questions about free speech and the relationship to the First Amendment, raises questions of multiculturalism. It has to do with a lot of questions on the campus about speech and so on. And so I want to get into that a little bit. And I want to talk about this political correctness notion in relationship to the free speech question. And of course, it arises very often from the idea that people use offensive speech. And what do we do about that? What do we do when people use racial slurs? What do we do when that happens on campuses? What about newspapers printing that kind of thing? And it seems as though the way the discussion has evolved is that we've had a long period of liberal ideas that that promote free speech. We have a whole First Amendment tradition along that line. And yet we find now that many groups find language offensive. Women, racial minorities, members of the gay community, and so on. And the question is, how do you protect them, or how do they end up dealing with language that they find offensive? So do you want to jump in on some of that?
Yes, Jim, I would like to. A lot of the ideas regarding political correctness have been limited in most people's minds to the academic campus, college in particular, and I think our experience recently has been that the same issues apply outside of academia. I look, for instance, at the recent Clarence Thomas hearings and see how free speech is played out there versus the rights of the individual to protection from possible harassment, and which value is held higher and more valued, that of free speech, one person's right perhaps to say things that are demeaning to another person, versus the idea that the person has protection under law from the things that are said to them. So like all good ethics issues, it comes down to an area of competing rights, whether it's on campus, whether it's a Washington hearing.
Well, you can make it sort of maybe more specific if you think of the women's issues and pornography. No, I mean, you've got a free speech idea that says, you can publish anything along that line, and we have all kind of magazines that do that and so on. And yet women's groups, who often have been seen to be very liberal in many ways and liberal in many causes, then find themselves in sort of a bind. They say to themselves, well, this material, pornographic material, is bad for women. It's demeaning to women. Many people think it causes violence to women, and so on. So now what do we do about regulating all of that? In other words, I think that there's many individuals, when they look at these questions, find themselves personally in a bind. In other words, there's many people who have cherished freedom in this country, I think liberals and conservatives, and who've said that that's what the country's about, and we have freedom and so on. But now we're seeing that society seems to be suffering from some expressions of this freedom. See it also in the rise of racism, I suppose. But let's just stay with the women's question a minute.
Yeah, it seems rather like we're getting into a category shift where some of the old values, the free icon of free speech, for instance, was held higher than perhaps individual rights to respect. And So a liberal knew where he or she would come down, and a conservative person knew where he or she would come down, and it was fairly clear to us. Now, as a lifelong liberal, I find myself responding with the conservatives on particular issues, and so a categorical confusion. Where do I fit? What are my responses? The women's issue, for instance, pornography. Women react now to issues, for instance. Well, I teach composition at the university, and we're spending the whole quarter examining gender issues. And one of the ideas of discussing gender issues is that all male discourse, argument, for instance, is essentially rape of women. That the sheer act of arguing or debate is a power play, and that is a particularly male characteristic. That's a difficult thing to deal with, because I've been raised in that tradition, been schooled in that tradition. And yet, if it's offensive to a woman, a style of communication, a style that you and I believe brings us closer, hopefully, to some truth, that style is in itself offensive. I don't know what to do or where to come down.
Right. Well, I think you've expressed some of the confusion that many people, there becomes a confusion, I think, liberal conservative kind of things, and you find people aligning themselves in odd positions along this. You find liberals and conservatives coming together on some of these issues where they had fought in other situations. And it also seems like the very terms begin to change meaning in a way. And so it's hard to just label a liberal and conservative position on this question of political correctness. I think, too, that a lot of people then feel personally anguished by it. When you look at this freedom of speech idea, many of us have championed that. We have thought that the way you deal with freedom of speech issues or controversial issues is by open debate and by not suppressing ideas, and that we get into sort of the marketplace of ideas. And if your idea doesn't hold up, if it's prejudicial, if it's stereotypical, that I will be able to show that. And through dialogue, discussion, often harsh debate, we'll really come to some conclusions along this line, or I'll be able to show that your position is detrimental to the well-being of society and so on. So we've operated sort of out of that mindset, it seems to me, that many of us have, that we're not looking for rules and legalisms in order to protect us within that marketplace of ideas. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. I'm sure I'm showing my age when I say that in the past things seemed to be more negotiable and less adversarial than they presently are. That we made the basic assumption that people were of goodwill and therefore could discuss and debate issues from a position understood to be one of goodwill and good intention. Now the world feels more adversarial, but as I say, that may surely be a function of my age. I also recognize that I am not able to share the woman's experience. I'm not able to share the experience of being perceived as a second-class citizen stuck in stereotypical roles. So I'm not a very effective critic of what is offensive to particular groups and what is not.
Even if you don't know that, the question that seems to be arising is, how much protection is given to them as they perceive it. Do we have to have laws, policies, and so on in agencies, in governmental groups, in universities to protect those people who are on the margin? Or I suppose some white males would say, well, what laws are you going to have to protect me from being attacked, as though I'm the one who always causes the problem. So even if we don't understand what the other group is feeling or thinking, we still got the problem. I mean, the call for protection. And I guess that word politically correct is applied to people who want to have that sort of protection. Isn't that the people who are calling, like, you can't use language like that, you can't speak like that to women because that's not, as is said, politically correct. It's so the charge by the one group is that the other group is raising some new doctrinaire approach, that they're going away from the free exchange of ideas and are saying that, well, you can't use this kind of language, and we're going to protect against that and have policies against it. And I suppose on the other side, people are saying, but the First Amendment protects free speech.
Exactly. I think it seems to us, those of us at a certain age, that somehow the rules that we have lived by, experienced each other by, related by the rules, have been changed in midstream, and here I am with an approach which appears to be anachronistic in this day and age, that once again people of goodwill may talk freely and dialogue issues from a position of equality. I do recognize that what perhaps you and I have considered a position of equality has perhaps been equal for you and I, but has excluded others. And certainly I have no doubt we owe reparations of some sort, or at least owe sensitivity to the excluded groups. I'm just not sure how that is acted out, how I play that out, how you're responsible for acting that out in your life.
That's the thing I think that many are wrestling with as a result is, let's try to clarify this issue a little bit, Ernie. I want to remind ourselves here of the First Amendment, which is often played out in all of this. So it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So that's often debated and so on. Then the next clause, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And then it goes on about the right of peaceable assembly and so on. But abridging the freedom of speech or the press, Congress should make no law. So it's sort of a universal kind of statement here. I know that when the Supreme Court then gets the job of sort of interpreting this throughout history, and we see that maybe there's been some exceptions here that are not allowed, that the free speech does not allow libel, it doesn't allow incitement to imminent lawlessness, doesn't allow obscenity, and it doesn't allow what the courts have called fighting words. Fighting words, the kind of things that would cause incite to violence, I suppose, or cause others to want to attack you back. So there would be. So that's one, thing we should keep in mind, that the First Amendment, really, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, does not end up being universal.
That's interesting, and I wasn't aware of all those exceptions. It rather feels like here they give you the amendment supporting the idea of free speech, and then with all the exclusions and exceptions, including fighting words, it comes down to whose ox is being gored, and does there remain any protection under the First Amendment? And that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an immediate answer.
I'm looking at a particular author here, Ernie, in Charles Bryan by name, and he is saying that, and I don't know his background really, but he is saying here that, making a distinction, that the courts would not come down on saying that we couldn't use language because of its content, but it has said that authorities can place certain restrictions on the time, place, and manner where free speech takes place. So that universities, for example, could say, well, in certain situations, this language can't be used. It could be used in this free speech area, or could be used in a particular setting in the university, but at this situation, at this graduation exercise, that we're not allowing that to happen here. So then it becomes possible, at least, that some of these things are constitutional and can be, that those kind of restrictions can be made. So what I'm saying is a distinction between content, what is said, this pornographic material, as we've used the example here, or racial slurs. On the other hand, there is the question of the manner and the time and place where this free speech takes place.
It also factored into that is that magic word authority. without specifying who the authority is, how one becomes an authority, that can make decisions in particular cases. And we're looking so much more closely at the idea of authority in the church, presidents of universities, Supreme Court justices. I don't think life is as simple as the days when authority was very clear-cut. And so when you embed the word authority in these exceptions, the authority to make the exceptions, we, or at least I, and some people I know, become immediately skeptical at, gee, I didn't vote for them. Did you vote for them? Who made them authority?
Well, a lot of this gets focused on the campus, Ernie. While I think this question of political correctness and free speech is one that concerns us as a culture as a whole and society as a whole, much of it has gotten focused on the campuses, where you saw an increase in racial incidents and sexual harassment and so on, and there felt a need, many universities felt a need to set a policy to say we can't have that. Here's what the University of Michigan, they set a policy in 1988 as a result of racial incidents on campus, and they said the policy bans, quote, any behavior, verbal or physical, that stigmatizes or victimizes an individual on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, sex, sexual orientation, creed, national origin, ancestry, age, marital status, handicap, or, and I'm still quoting, Vietnam-era veteran status. Now, that was the policy set up by the University of Michigan in 1988. In other words, it's saying that you could not use behavior, verbal or physical, that would do any of those things, stigmatize or victimize on the basis of any of those things, where we recognize race, sex, sexual orientation, etc. Now, furthermore, what happened with that case was that it eventually got shot down by the courts. That the court said that this was you couldn't do this, that this was too restrictive, that the First Amendment, I don't know exactly how the case was argued, but it turns out that this policy, because it's so broad, that it's found to be unconstitutional. Now, maybe that sort of solidifies. You can see what's behind it. In other words, you got people at the university saying, we can't have this graffiti in the men's room, knocking other people. We can't have anti-Semitic statements, anti-black statements. We can't have people putting down women. This is not proper. It's uncivil. Doesn't fit in with our democratic, egalitarian approach in this country. Therefore, we're going to set a policy so this won't happen. That is what has gotten labeled by many people as politically correct. A prime example that you got the same thing at the University of Wisconsin, which tried to rewrite it in another way and so on. But that's
and Dartmouth, where our friend D'Souza, who wrote the book Illiberal Education, went to school. He was head of the Dartmouth Review, which was a newspaper which had included a lot of anti-Semitic articles or anti-African American articles. And his paper was shut down by the authorities at Dartmouth, and he's been reacting to it ever since.
He's been one of the main spokespersons attacking this political correct idea.
Right, exactly. The interesting thing for me, of course, about the Michigan rule that they had turned down was that that same law would preclude then the possibility of any prophetic behavior by a priest or minister from the pulpit in terms of making distinctions between that which is good and that which is not good. It would seem to me that so much was included that was forbidden, that what would one be left to give a homily about on Sunday morning?
Yeah. Right. Here's what the court that threw this out as a federal district court in Detroit threw out this university policy, and the opinion read, the university may subject all speech and conduct to reasonable and non-discriminatory time, place, and manner restrictions. You get back to that manner idea there, which are narrowly tailored and which leave open ample alternative means of communication. So you could say we can't do it during this particular segment of university life, but you could do it other way. What the university could not do, however, quoting, was establish an anti-discrimination policy which had the effect of prohibiting certain speech because it disagreed with ideas or messages sought to be conveyed. Looking at the plain language of the policy, it is simply impossible to discern any limitation on its scope or any conceptual distinction between protected and unprotected conduct. So it's too broad. That's what they didn't like about it. And I think that's the point that you were just making.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Now, Ernie, what do we, let's say that, how do we end up solving this thing? I mean, what directions are we going to go in to try to create some reasonable approach to the idea that people are getting hurt by language? Now, one approach is to say the marketplace of ideas, that what has to happen is that we need to find good ways to challenge offensive kind of language. We have to be able to show that it's based on stereotypes, that it is not scientifically sound, bring up counter arguments, and so on. I think that's been the idea. And I think another distinction one might make is that what goes on in a classroom at a university, which is where we ought to have a free flow of ideas, where if we restrict ideas in a classroom, then it really becomes difficult to get what is behind the prejudicial statements, what are the presuppositions that need to be attacked, what are the assumptions that science might disprove, and so on.
Exactly. Another issue we run into related to all of this is what I think of as discrepancies in power. A friend of mine said, for instance, what was wrong with Clarence Thomas inviting Anita Hill out to have dinner with him? And in that small circumference of idea, probably absolutely nothing. But when one looks at the power discrepancy between the employer and the employee, or the teacher and the student, or the priest and the parishioners, then a different sort of a loading. If the authorities define something as free speech, and that is the ultimate value, and then those same authorities misuse that idea, we have a real conundrum there.
Yes, you do. And I mean, I think that is what those labeled as politically correct often bring out, that the playing field is not level.
Exactly.
I mean, blacks are saying that in the situation, if you have a slur against white males who make up the dominant population, that it is not as hurting, or is not as demeaning, or not as economically destructive as would happen if a group on the margins is vilified in some way or another, or stereotyped. So it always raises that power relationship there. And I think that the groups that feel that they are out and on the margins are looking for ways to protect themselves. And then I think there's members of the white male establishment who are sensitive to this, are saying, yeah, I feel for them. I mean, I don't know exactly what it means to be put down or to be a minority in a grouping, but it can't be good. And I know I fall into sort of stereotypical thinking myself, and I've hurt people that way out of insensitivity. Therefore, I don't want that to happen. Therefore, I bond with them. I create solidarity with these marginalized people, and therefore I look for ways to protect them in a way. I think that's part of the dynamic psychologically that's at work in the politically correct camp.
Yes, I agree, Jim. And of course, you and I have a historic precedent in terms of liberation theology coming from South and Central America, helping us look at the Gospels from a different angle of vision, and having a better sense of what it is like to be marginalized. Even though we have never experienced it, we can see what Christ had to say about that experience of marginalization and what our responsibilities are in terms of responding to those who are marginalized.
You can really make this thing extreme, and you can say, what if a group brings in a follower or brings in Louis Farrakhan, and it ends up creating, violence after the talk comes onto campus, or we allow him to disseminate his views on television or whatever, or if you have neo-Nazis who support Hitler's ideas, and are we going to give them free rein or free speech here to propagate their ideas where it might lead to violence to other people? I mean, in other words, you can, and these examples have happened. In other words, we know situations where speech like that really has ended up promoting violence to other people.
Exactly. I was very proud of the ACLU, for instance, when they allowed the Nazis, took Skokie, Illinois authorities to court so that they would allow the Nazis to march through Skokie, which was at that time predominantly Jewish. And I thought, isn't that a great victory for free speech? Now, if the neo-Nazis had been marching through Sylvania, I am not sure exactly what my response would have been. It's so easy to be abstract and theoretical when it's not my ox that's being gored.
Well, you've again placed in good context there the dilemma that we face. I don't think, Ernie, that we've done much by way of solving this problem. We've been talking about political correctness, and one aspect of that whole buzzword is the relationship between the First Amendment, which guarantees free speech in our country, and the fact that there are groups, especially those on the margins or those who are in a dominated position in one way or another, who are trying to protect themselves and to carve out a place within this society. I think we have set the parameters of the question well. I mean, what side you come down on it is perhaps harder to say. My own sense is that just the restrictive measures are not going to make it, that there has to be this free flow of ideas, and the way we want to counteract that kind of stereotyping is by good argumentation and cultivating a proper moral sense.